Mark. And please, go right ahead.
Terrific.
Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'm Mark Arnold, son of Fredric Arnold. And I'd like to start by thanking all the veterans in the room for your service. I have not served in the military, but that doesn't in any way diminish my appreciation for what all of these folks have done for us. It's very sincere gratitude. So Dad and I don't do a lot of public speaking these days, but Mike was very persistent, and he really pushed to try and get us out. So we wanted to come out. My compliments to Broomfield for having such a wonderful facility like this. It's really very impressive. This is the first time that we've been here. So to introduce myself a little bit, I'm going to start by telling a joke because I think it sort of describes the relationship a little bit between Dad and me. There was this very famous doctor who used to go on speaking engagements all around, and he had a chauffeur. And the chauffeur, dressed up like a driver, would take him from place to place, and this very famous doctor would get up there and talk about neurosurgery and the latest techniques and so forth. And after about a half a dozen of these presentations, the chauffeur said to the doctor, "You know, I've heard you talk so many times, even I could give it." And the doctor says, "Oh, you think it's that easy? Well, pull over. We're going to switch clothes, and the next stop, you're going to give the talk." So they did that. They swapped clothes. They walked in. The chauffeur was introduced as this famous surgeon. He goes up to the stage. They've got the PowerPoint. He gives the whole talk. Big standing ovation. It goes great. The talk is perfect. At the end of the talk, someone stands up with a question and asks this very complicated question. Well, when the medulla oblongata does this, and so forth, a big long thing. So the chauffeur looks at the guy in the audience and he says, "That is such a simple question, even my chauffeur in the back of the room can answer that." So the reason I start with that joke is I want it really clear. I am the chauffeur here. Okay, I grew up hearing a number of these stories. Dad has asked me to help support him when we make these presentations, but he's the real deal, and I am just facilitating by helping tell some of the stories that bring you up to date, really, in terms of what we're doing these days. So, Dad, do you want to say anything, or shall I kick it off?
Oh, you're doing fine.
Okay. So, especially when we get to the Q&A, I'll turn it over to the chauffeur in the back of the room and let him address the simple questions. So,
are we going to use this thing?
We are.
Oh.
Yes. Yeah. So we've brought along some slides to share with you. You're more than welcome to ask questions as we go along. But this will just encapsulate what's going on today, and we're hoping that you'll find it interesting because it's something that I certainly am very devoted to. So December 7th, 1941 happened. There was an enormous reaction to that. Ultimately, 16 million Americans signed up to serve in the service of our country. This is a photo of Dad in primary training as early as, I'm going to guess this was about March or April of 1943. So, 42, I'm sorry. So prior to that, Dad was, like my teenage kids, oblivious. Life is going on. Suddenly December 7th happens. And he and so many millions of others dropped what they were doing and joined the service. So in a few short months later, very short months by today's standards, and with very minimal training compared to what our servicemen today receive to fly frontline fighters, he stepped through basic, primary, advanced training and was then put into a P-38 Lightning, which was built by Lockheed. And this was a 14,000-pound aircraft, 2 Allison engines, 4 machine guns in the nose, and a 20-millimeter cannon. And these were single-seaters. So for those who are not familiar with the type, when a pilot of that era first flew their P-38, they flew it alone. There was no dual instruction. There were no simulators. At that point, they were just told, well, you know how a stick and rudder works, the throttle's over here. They'd be given a blindfold test to prove they knew where the controls were, and off they go. So in addition to combat fatalities, there was a horrific amount of injuries and death due to training accidents, because the U.S. was in such an extreme rush to get into the war at that point, to transition from a peace footing to a war standing was just compressed into a matter of months. And if you were of that age, and if you signed up, you very quickly went from peacetime into combat. So this is the aircraft in flight. Dad says he thought it was an easy plane to fly. It was a beautiful plane to fly. But first and foremost, it was a weapon. And this is the aircraft. It could carry underneath the wings. It had two hard points. In later models, they added rockets to the outboard wings. But when Dad was flying the F model, you could either carry a combination.
G.
You went into combat with an F or a G?
G.
A G model. My chauffeur has corrected me, and he went into combat with a G model. So these could either be bombs or fuel tanks for longer missions. So not much later, so by July of '43, Dad was now stationed in North Africa, and the U.S. And the Allies were then pushing Rommel back across North Africa and trying to rid that theater from the Germans. And here he is sitting in his combat suit. And you'll see here the line of the cockpit goes right across here. So they had zero tolerance, and Dad was only about 5'7" in those days.
5'7".
Yeah. And the reason that he's jacked up so high here is that in that theater, they had the pilots sitting on top of an inflatable raft in case they went, because they were flying back and forth across the Mediterranean. So the thought was if they went down, they would be able to, inflate the raft and have a better chance of survival. But the downside was that it made them so high in the cockpit, only the very shortest guys could really fit, and there was just zero tolerance. So
wouldn't it have been extremely hot in the cockpit once you put the...
Yeah, so on the ground, of course, in those days, these aircraft had nothing like air conditioning. So you had the worst of both worlds. On the ground, it was hot as hell under this plexiglass bubble in the desert, right? And then they would take off, and on some of their missions, they had high altitude missions at 30,000 feet, escorting the bombers, and the heater was horrible. So the heater was really not up to the task. So they would broil on the surface and then freeze at altitude. So it was, creature comfort was very low on the list of priorities of aircraft design in those days. I'm sorry?
Was a parachute? Did the pilot have a parachute?
Yes, and so the pilot would don the parachute, strap into the parachute, and then sit into the aircraft, and then the crew chief would lean in and strap them into the aircraft. And as a small digression, after one of the missions, do you mind if I tell that story?
Oh, I thought, yeah, I think you're doing very well.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So,
And here,
no.
I'll do a little dance.
So behind the seat was armor. There was a piece of armor plate behind the seat and under the seat for smaller caliber munitions. And after a flight, it was typical for the crew chief to lean in and help the pilot out. And on one mission, the dad came back from the flight, his crew chief unbuckled him, and he was then going to get out of the plane, which was customary, and he couldn't get out of the cockpit. Something was holding him down, and the crew chief said, well, lean forward. Let me take a look in there, Lieutenant.
I'll do this. I'll lean forward.
Yeah.
So you know what we're doing.
So the crew chief put his hand down there, picked his hand up, and it was covered in blood. And he said, you've been hit. He goes, really? I didn't know. And so they undid the parachute, and a bullet had penetrated the armor and then penetrated the parachute, and just about a half an inch of it was sticking through the parachute. So if he had to bail out, he couldn't have gotten out because it was pinning the parachute to the seat. So he got out of the plane and said, well, at least I get my Purple Heart.
Yeah.
And the CO called him in later and said, listen, we know that in combat you're hunched forward during combat, and you only lean back after combat. So they said our determination is the bullet didn't go into you, you went into the bullet. So you don't get the Purple Heart. So he was an artist, right? So he made a giant Purple Heart, and he goes marching all around the base saying, I deserve my Purple Heart. Yeah. So there.
Did he ever get it?
No.
They're going outdoor.
Yeah. So on a more sober note, when Dad went into, so of course in those days, 500 or 1,000 initial enlistees would enter the Army Air Corps, and then through a process of training and washing out, it would winnow down to a smaller and smaller and smaller number until, in his case, of the original group that showed up, by the time they graduated as fighter pilots, there were 14 in the class of 42J. 14. And now that's not the entire class of 42J, but his group, the group that he went through, had gotten winnowed down to that 14. And they were very close. They kind of had a camaraderie. And all 14 of them were shipped to North Africa together to enter the service. And unfortunately, after only 6 months of combat, only 2 of these 14 were still alive. So 12 died in combat. And that's because early in the war, the Germans that they were fighting against were highly experienced aviators, and they were, in some cases, as little as 90 hours of flight time trying to pilot these, in those, what for the day was the most advanced fighters of the day. So the training was a big problem, the lack of experience, and then you'll see again in some future slides, although they were taught to fly the aircraft, at that point in the war, their training included almost nothing about tactics, about aerial combat tactics. They were clueless. So here they were initially based, their group in Algeria at Chateau d'Un-du-Ramel. And from there, the missions, they would meet each morning, they would get a briefing, find out what the target was, and from there they would head out across the Mediterranean Sea to try and go find their targets on these large islands. And we're all used to having cell phones with GPS these days, but in those days, all they had was just a magnetic heading and a time and an estimate. That was it, dead reckoning, and not even landmarks going across the water. So it was strictly dead reckoning. There was no opportunity to correct mid-course. So thankfully, the Allies were successful in pushing Rommel back, and as the battle lines moved to the east, they were then able to reposition the squadron out in Tunisia from Matur, and from this destination, then the missions were able to reach targets in Italy. So that was his 71st Fighter Squadron. Well, I mentioned that the training was really lacking in those days because the resources just didn't permit it. And Dad was first and foremost an artist, and to this day we still don't know, we've not met other artists that served in that theater as fighter pilots. But after the missions, his routine was that his crew chief would hand him a sketch pad right there in the cockpit, and he'd quickly jot down the outlines of something he wanted to capture mentally. And then later, he had a setup where he could do these ink and wash drawings from those quick sketches. So he flew, initially when they went over, there was to be 25 missions, and then they'd be able to come back. When Dad was at 22 missions, less than a third of his original group were still alive, and they came in and said, good news, now we're bumping it to 50 missions. So that was essentially a death sentence statistically, because if you're only halfway there and only a third are left, you know.
Very bad on math. All of a sudden, it changed from 25 to 50. You know, go figure that one.
Yeah. So
I was a squadron leader at that time, by the way.
Yeah.
It helped a lot. So I have a few guys behind me.
Yeah.
And that was very good.
So the point of it was that they had this constant replenishment of new pilots coming in to replace those who were being killed. And because they were coming in so green and they didn't know what they needed to know, he would use these drawings as a way to train the new guys the fatal lessons that were, you know, paid for in blood, so to speak, by guys who made mistakes. So each one of these typically displayed a fatal mistake. So this guy, he's saying, for God's sakes, here's our squadron over there. The strength of our squadron is in numbers. We need to stick together as a squadron. And this bozo was hot to go get a kill. So he split off hot dogging. He went over here, and yeah, he got this guy, but by making himself vulnerable, he got killed. So he said, that's no way to win the war. You know, we need to stick together to concentrate our firepower. This is not a one-man show like World War I. We're not, you know, Red Barons out there. We have a job to do, and we'll be more effective if we stick together. So this is just one example. Another quick one here was the squadron attacked. Their target was a train yard, and they learned that by going perpendicular to the train, that was a bad strategy, because if they released their bombs a microsecond early or late, they would miss the train. So he said to everyone, you know, as the squadron leader, he said, if we've got to attack trains, let's go lengthwise. Let's go longitudinal, because that way you can hardly miss. It's a big, long target. You drop it anywhere along there, we're going to hit the train. So there were lessons about these tactics. This was a story where, because all of this, the saying was they learn the job on the job. One day they get a shipment of skip bombs, and there had never been any mention of skip bombs in training. And it was kind of like, here's a little like Post-it note that says, here, drop these on the water when you're aimed at a boat, and you'll sink the boat. So they come shooting across the water here at about 15 feet, a squadron on a good day of 12 fighters. And at 15 feet, which is, you know, roughly the height of the ceiling, when they line up on the target was this ship at, this was Puerto Torres?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this was the target. The intelligence said, we need to take out that ship, so drop the bombs over here. They didn't know how far away to drop the bombs. They dropped the bombs, and like a stone that skips across the water, these bombs were intended to skip across the water, bouncing, 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 and then impact the ship with a 6-second delayed fuse and then blow up the ship. Well, since they had never done this before, they just used their best guess. They dropped the bombs somewhere way over here, go skip, 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 and it happened that the bombs were high in their skip when they passed this ship. So instead of impacting down near the water line, which was the intention, that's what would sink the ship, they flew right through the superstructure, right? And there wasn't enough material to trigger the weapons. Aircraft? 6 seconds?
6 seconds.
Yeah.
Before it would blow up.
Yeah, with a delay on the fuse.
Yeah, delay.
So the bombs shot through the superstructure of this ship, and the bombs lodged in the next ship, which was not their target. So they, at first they thought, oops, we missed. But then the squadron was beginning to fly over the ship. They didn't know how abruptly to pull up. When lo and behold, intelligence didn't know it, this was a munitions ship. So when this one blew, it was a catastrophic explosion. The entire squadron were flipped up and almost took out the whole squadron. And they just barely managed to escape. So it was a death-defying kind of mistake. So clearly this was a lesson. So like almost after every mission they would say, well, we're never going to do that again, right? I mean, they're trying to learn fast enough to survive. Yeah.
So was the target ship actually taken out by the explosion of the ammo ship?
Do you know if this ship was destroyed by that explosion, or did it survive?
This one survived.
Yeah, so that
There
one
was
survived.
nothing, it was just a,
Yeah,
that's the only one that blew
Yeah.
up.
right.
And you could see this guy over here.
Yep.
I was over here, and this guy is going like that. He got caught in the blast.
Right. And then here's one sneaking out. He got past it before the explosion and so
I
forth.
think
So
he's doing very well.
yeah, okay.
That's my son.
Yeah.
Sharp kid.
Yeah. So
Good genes.
yeah. So of the 14, these are the actual names of the 12 who died in Dad's group from the class of 42J. And that left just Dad and one other gentleman by the name of Jim Hagenbach. So of the original 14, only they were left. And as the survivors, they stayed in contact after the war for many, many years. And they had a very close bond. Very close bond, yeah.
What is knee calm?
So Dad was born Fredric Cohn.
AOH.
That was the family name. Prior to the war, he became known as an artist using the name Fredric Arnold. So during the service, he used his legal name Cohn, but immediately after the war, he changed it to Arnold to resume his life as an artist. So I think that there's supposed to be an accent, I think, over the E or something. It's an expression that says formerly. So instead of so instead of Prince, formerly known as he's, yes, born Cohn, right.
What did he say?
Yeah, it's just that, yeah, born, right, yep. So they had a very close relationship, and they met many times over the years and visited each other at each other's homes and stayed in close contact. And they always felt a debt of gratitude to the 12 because they felt it was a large dose of luck that they lived, and it was in many cases the lessons learned by the other guys' deaths that allowed the few of them to survive. So whenever they met, they always expressed this enormous kinship and gratitude and sense of loss at the ones that were not there. And over the years, they made a solemn vow to each other that between the two of them, whoever was the last one standing would do something to honor the 12 to whom they owed so much. So over the years, Dad endeavored to fulfill that because in '98, Jim died, and he called Dad to his deathbed and he said, hey, it's not me, I'm not going to be the last one, it's down to you. You need to figure out something. So Dad tried a number of things. He wrote what ultimately became a best-selling autobiographical novel called Doorknob 5-2. But that didn't really do it. A very talented young filmmaker did a documentary, and that also was not really about the 12 guys. Dad then took the maps, the briefing maps from World War II that were now 60 years old or so, and used those as a canvas. So these are the maps that he cut down and mounted to create. So this is the Mediterranean. It doesn't show up well here, but there are about 20 of these little vignettes that he painted on those maps, using the maps as a canvas. And it was turned into a memorial mural, and this toured some aviation museums, mostly on the West Coast. And each of these characterized something that the squadron did. So on one mission, for instance, they went out and flew top cover. Dad flew top cover over a Sunderland flying boat that was sent out to rescue one of their pilots.
And there's two Messerschmitts above it.
Yes. So when they arrived on station, they're orbiting the Sunderland, and they looked up and there were two Me-109 Messerschmitts, but they were not attacking. So they were kind of like, fine, if you don't want to attack, cool, you stay up there. And at the time they thought they're being gentlemanly.
I thought they were nice.
That they were allowing this rescue to take place. So the Sunderland sent out a little boat. They retrieved the pilot. They brought him back into the plane. They took off again, and now the Sunderland was so slow the P-38s had to sort of orbit over them as they went along. And Dad transmits on the radio. He says, "Snoopy 2," which was their call sign. "Snoopy 2, how is our wet friend?"
Yeah.
And the Sunderland pilot says,
He says, they're wet all right, but he's not one of ours, it's one of theirs. So we took that's why these two guys up there were circling, and when they weren't gentlemen, they figured that they knew who was in that rat.
Yeah. Unfortunately, their comrade perished. So the one they went to go rescue had already expired, so he wasn't there. And then there are, as you've seen in Hollywood movies and so forth, the chaotic scenes where the bombers are transiting on their bombing run, and then the Allied fighters are now trying to defend them against attacking fighters. And this was another type of mission where they would go on bomber escorts. And then, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Tell them, go ahead.
Yeah, let's move along on that one, because I think we've already kind of gone over. So, and then another type of mission that they flew was close air support, where there might be a large action on the ground, and they'd be called in to try and support the troops on the ground. In this particular case, this was the invasion of Sicily in August of '43. And on this particular day, Dad was shot down right up over here by Lake Lentini, and then made his way on foot from here back through the retreating Axis forces to reconnect with the Allied forces. And that's described in his book. So it was a rude awakening for a fighter pilot to suddenly be on the ground in the midst of a real battle.
I didn't figure on that.
Yeah.
It was a surprise.
So he made his way back and then flew his last mission. They also did bombing and strafing for targets on the ground. So on this memorial mural on the chart, he had these 20 or so different vignettes. And one of the vignettes that just kind of came to him out of wherever was he started noodling away, and he describes that even he was surprised at what came out of his paintbrush, right? Was this picture of a mission briefing. So here are the names of the guys, here's the squadron leader, here's the map, and he's speaking to the squadron, explaining what the nature of the mission is. But intermingled along with these fellows are the spirits of the guys who had already died. And here's a close-up of that. And it kind of flowed by itself artistically that this scene, it wasn't just the guys here, it's the presence of the guys who were there yesterday and the day before and the day before. And it was a very touching concept that resonated for him. And it occurred to him that in this scene, he visualized that 5 of the 12 in his mind were already dead. All 12 in the scene are destined to die. Each mission truly was a Russian roulette, and unlike Hollywood, where it's bang, bang, shoot 'em up with the heroic air combat and all that stuff, Hollywood has never really depicted this moment, like in a room like this, where these young men are deciding, some 19, 20, 21-year-old guys are deciding every morning, every day, to go back into combat. And that moment of recommitment was really sort of a quiet courage that had not been commemorated. So it's this day after day Russian roulette kind of mentality that struck him.
We killed as many Germans.
Right, so it wasn't just the fear of death, but also, of course, the burden of killing. So it struck him that this should really be amplified. So it took him about 2 years to work through the details, the ideas that he wanted to incorporate into a three-dimensional model of that scene. And this is a very small desktop model. Each of these figures are only about 6 or 7 inches tall. And it wasn't meant to be a finished piece. It's like a sketch. The French call it a maquette. And it's a model that incorporated all of his ideas. And it took a long time to work on that. And then he went to work on expanding those with the help of an assistant to then enlarge them. But the heavy lifting mentally had been the ideas, the significance of each of the 12. And each of these 12 were not intended to be likenesses of his 12 comrades. These are archetypes of what they all either experienced or kinds of identities and what went on at the time. So this one, the first one to be finished, and this is the one that Mike saw. Oh, we lost Mike. The one that you saw at the dairy was teenager, and teenager represented the 19-year-olds that were in combat, if you can imagine that. I can't even begin to fathom it. So here's Dad happily next to the very first one. Each of these, the originals, had to be sculpted in 250 pounds of clay. So there's 12 of them. So the project, which he began in earnest at the age of 89, meant manipulating 3,000 pounds of clay. So this is figure 2, Squadron Leader. So this is now life size, not that they were tall, these are like 5'6", 5'7", and he's standing in front of a symbolic map here. And what you're seeing here is a photograph of this sculpture in clay, the original. Shortly after this photo was taken, in each of these clay originals, molds were pulled from the clay, and that process destroys the clay. So this doesn't exist anymore, only the negative molds exist. And this, you can see, here's the compass signifies this. There's the string. Here's a marker signifying what the target would be. And then down here is a scale, a mile scale. And this is how they navigated. They would pull the string across, read off the heading, and then holding the string right there, they'd bring down the arc and read off the miles. And that was it, all right? Just heading and distance.
Flight planning.
Yeah, that's flight planning, exactly. So this is close-up what the squadron leader looks like, and he's intent delivering the mission to the group. So here's figure number 3, good looking, and Dad witnessed a situation where when they're flying as a squadron, the planes are in close formation as a pair. So an element leader and his wingman, and they would be flying through the air like this. Well, this fellow in real life actually made a mistake and flew into his own element leader, and they both died in combat as a result because his propellers sheared off the tail of the other plane, and they both went down. So this, 5 of them are spirits, right? So this is one of the spirits. And the spirits, you know, bronze is finished with a color called a patina. And that's what makes them look bronze color. So all of the others are bronze completely. The spirits are going to be finished in a gradient with bronze at the bottom and then fading to a lighter color at the top, signifying that the spirits are fading away. And they also are depicted dressed as they were when they died. So here he's wearing his helmet and his mask and his goggles. Some of them are wearing their oxygen mask. He's wearing his flight gloves, boots, and so forth. And he's feeling very remorseful because he was responsible for taking out not only himself, but also his comrade. So this one, Lucky Strike, this is a more senior pilot, so he's the archetype for a pilot that might have already flown 10, 20 missions. He's sitting in the briefing, and he's not buying it because they're also making predictions about the weather, and they're making predictions about enemy strength that they're going to encounter, and he has seen over and over again that those intelligence reports are not always accurate. So he's sitting there saying, yeah, sure, yeah, I've been here before. Eager Beaver is one of the pilots who's writing down the heading, 63 degrees, the distance, 575 miles. And early in the war, because the U.S. did not have air superiority, they were very concerned that if the planes went down, if there were maps on board, the enemy would be able to figure out where their base was and then come in and attack them. So there were no maps allowed in the plane. So all they went with was just the heading and the distance. So Eager Beaver is writing that down in the palm because the thought was by the time they got shot down, they could rub this out of their palm. It's just pencil, and that way it would deprive the enemy of knowing how to backtrack.
Excuse me. Each one, that shows one, but all of them did.
Yes, so each of these archetypes really represented the era of what was going on. So even though just one is writing in the palm of his hand, they all did that at that time during the war. Frenchie is a spirit who has his arms draped around his comrades. They are intensely focused on the mission briefing because they're still living, but they feel the presence of Frenchie still there, maybe even from the prior mission. So that the absence of those who had gone before was very present. Here's Montana. So here he is. He's a new guy in the squadron. He's got his hand up. He's asking questions. He doesn't even know the basics. So simple questions like, well, what if we get separated and lost? How do we find our way home? How do we, it was a real blank for these guys. So he's asking questions. Lonesome, unfortunately, was wounded in the cockpit, but these were not bomber pilots where there was a crew of... The bombers, tragically, would often come home with lots of wounded soldiers on board because they'd get, strafed. There'd be all kinds of horrible injuries in the plane, but they would be flown home. The fighter pilot, in this case, Lonesome, was wounded in combat. He survived the aerial combat, but then he bled out on the way trying to fly back from the Mediterranean, passed out, and crashed. So very often in that theater, there were, even after the pilots were killed, there were no bodies because they'd go down in the ocean and they could never be retrieved. Tail End Charlie signifies the fact that the youngest, newest guys in terms of the position in the squadron would be Tail End Charlie, the last guy in line. And unfortunately, that was the highest risk position because if they were jumped by enemy fighters, they would attack the last guy first and then work their way up the line. So this spirit was killed on his very first mission. So here's Tail End Charlie. He never had a chance to progress and work his way up the line. So you can see this is not just art, it's an educational piece to try to convey some of this material. So this is Stud. Stud is a spirit, and he has his hand comforting Lonesome from the beginning. So the guy who killed his buddy, this is the buddy that died, and he's comforting him, saying, hey, it's combat. He's trying to comfort the other spirit that these things happen in combat. Speed is looking at his watch because just, that was a principal navigational device. They would all synchronize their watches on their wrist. Then when they went to the aircraft, they'd sync the clock on the panel, and that's how they would organize the rendezvous. And then the last one, handsome, signifies later in the war a degree of optimism because the U.S. was pouring out munitions and equipment and soldiers and pushing all these resources out. And as the tide turned in favor of the Allies, the attitude became more of a sense that we were actually going to prevail. So he's sitting there with a degree of confidence on his face, and symbolically he was number 12 of the group. And it's as though he's so confident he's sitting there holding a cup of coffee, like more relaxed than the other guys. But Dad is quick to say that the last thing they would do is drink beverages before a mission. So that's symbolic. He says at 30,000 feet, you don't want to have to try to fish the thing out and take care of that. Yeah. So those are quick introductions of the 12 figures. I'll just walk you quickly through over the last several years what's been going on. We're very excited about where we are right now.
They're throwing us out, Mark.
Yeah, that's no. That's I'll wrap it up.
We can see you.
Yeah. Okay.
Much better with the light.
So you're all familiar, I hope, with Wings Over the Rockies, Air and Space Museum here in Denver. It's a wonderful museum. They have really embraced the program, and they are going to host the first public unveiling on August the 6th. So that's only a few months away. And on that day, they're going to do their best to bring out the media and really make a big presentation about it. And then it will be on display at the Wings Museum from August through the end of the year. And then at the end of the year, it will move to New Orleans, where it will be exhibited at the National World War II Museum. And for anyone who has not yet had the opportunity to go to that museum, I cannot speak highly enough. They've already raised and spent $250 million of private and public money. It's a spectacular 6-acre campus. The exhibits there will blow your mind, and they have set aside a very important location for Dad's sculpture to be exhibited indefinitely down there. So it will be a part of their exhibition, and we're very, very excited about that. We've gotten the endorsements of, we're very proud, we've gotten the endorsements of not one, not two, but 3 former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And in fact, this small sculpture, I'll hold it up so you can see it. Dad did it's my sister and I are trying to make this whole thing. Dad does the art. We're trying to get the program done. So there is a fundraising element of this, and those people who have played major roles are getting these recognition small. So this is Teenager, a miniature version of Teenager, and this one is headed to General Colin Powell because he's played a role in helping to support the program. And there's a little bit of a story about these, which is that Dad ultimately flew and survived 50 combat missions, right? So these small sculptures are a limited edition of 50 that correspond to the 50 missions. And Dad, in his beautiful penmanship, he has his amazing handwriting, kept a record in his pilot logbook of his combat missions from 43. And each recipient of these gets a copy of his combat logbook and a certificate which details that specific mission corresponding to that number. So General Powell gets number 9. Number 9 was a dive bombing mission to Matur, I believe. And so these have been well received, and folks are very pleased with these. I also just brought 4 copies of Dad's books if anyone wanted to pick up those. And we have brochures that describe the project. I'll just end on this last slide. Perhaps the most, I guess, gratifying part of the whole project is that although the sculpture was motivated, or I guess inspired, by Dad's intense memory and loss of those specific 12 guys, as the project has moved along, the significance of the project has grown, and now the sculpture is really dedicated to honoring not just the 12, but the 88,000 airmen who died in World War II. Actually, it's larger than 88,000, but that's the Army Air Corps. And then we have Marines and Coast Guard beyond even that. So we really are very grateful. It's something my sister and I have really taken on as a project. And we're very grateful, Mike, to you and all of you for coming out today to help us get the word out. We're very, very grateful to you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you.
Yeah. So, yes, absolutely. Yeah, so Dad would be happy to take questions. We also
I
have a
don't know if I
9.
can answer it.
We also
You
have.
just make up the answers.
Yeah.
I'll pick it up.
We also have a 9-minute video.
Yes.
And for those who want to stick around after the Q&A, that also tells the story in a very succinct way.
Doing with this.
You just kind of hold this somewhere in the vicinity. You don't have to hold it right up next to you.
And what is this? Hello.
Microphone.
Okay,
In fact, I think we can just clip it.
sure.
It will be good enough.
Give me I want a tough question.
Yeah.
Anybody got a question? That's enough.
Yes.
Easy question. Does the P-38 fly on one engine?
Oh, easy.
Oh,
The only trouble is if you lost an engine on takeoff. The power of 1,500 horsepower on each engine is so strong against little guys like me. You know, we had to do something about
So they only had about a second.
a second to do the right thing, which is really against.
Yeah.
Uh,
So,
I'm
yeah.
saying.
So to amplify on Dad's answer, if you lost an engine in flight, it was a non-event. Okay, it had plenty of power to fly.
No problem.
But when you're low and slow and you've just taken off, you rotate and now you're climbing away. If in that moment, unfortunately, and one of his colleagues died this way, if one of the engines quit, not only do you lose the power on that one engine, well, it's okay.
Yeah.
Here, I got it.
That's what you want.
Yeah. So not only